Hello and good morning. How are you doing?
Hello.
Good. Thank you for your patience. We had some slight technical difficulties prior, but luckily we're chugging forward. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes here to trickle in. I'm going to be your tech host for the day.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Hi, guys. I don't think
Hello.
my camera's going to work today, but I'm going to have audio. Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Is my mic working?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. And I see the note down here, the host will broadcast shortly.
Oh, I believe we are already broadcasting, so we should be good to go.
Okay. Sorry. So we're discussing queer lit as resistance today. I'm Johnny Townsend. I'll be moderating. I wrote the first book on the Upstairs Lounge Fire and was an associate producer on the documentary Upstairs Inferno. I've also written several other books, including Racism by Proxy, Kinky Quilts, and Constructing Equity. Let's briefly introduce our four panelists today. They are Logan Sage Adams, Carrie Byrd, Gemma Rolls-Bentley, and Maggie Thrash. Logan Sage Adams has loved romance and history for as long as they can remember, but it was only over the last few years that it occurred to them to bring them together. From rural Oklahoma in the 1930s to the Chicago's World's Fair in 1893, Logan likes to write whatever sparks her interest. Logan's first novel, Our Own Light, is a love story between a coal miner who is struggling to face his long-buried grief and a man from New York's social elite who has never really fit in with his peers. Set in an unincorporated 1920s mining town, Our Own Light is about healing, hope, and fighting for a better tomorrow. By publishing their historical romances, Logan hopes to explore often overlooked places and periods in romance and to remind the world that queer people have always been here. When she's not writing, Logan can be found at her home in Ohio, spending time with her supportive family. As a child, Carrie Byrd enjoyed making her Barbies kiss a little too much, so it's not really surprising that she grew up to write sapphic romance. Her debut novel, Loser of the Year, is an enemies to lovers romance about an unsuccessful actress who returns to her hometown to teach high school theater, immediately clashing with the school's arrogant girls' soccer coach. In February, she'll release her second book, a late bloomer romance about a 60-year-old woman who realizes she's a lesbian in love with her best friend. An English professor who works on queer literature, Carrie feels very lucky to have two jobs where she gets to read, write about, and discuss queer books. She lives just outside of Philadelphia with her favorite author of all time, who also happens to be her wife. Gemma Rolls-Bentley has been at the forefront of contemporary art for almost 2 decades, working passionately to champion diversity in the field. Her debut book, Queer Art, From Campus to Club and the Spaces Between, was published in spring 2024 by Frances Lincoln and has been highlighted as a must-read by Them, Dazed, Time Out, The Guardian, Cultured, and the FT. Her curatorial practice amplifies the work of female and queer artists and provides a platform for art that explores LGBTQIA+ identity. Gemma has curated for a range of international galleries and institutions, most recently Wolterton, Cardigan Arts, Carl Friedman Gallery, ICA London, Leslie Lohman Museum of Art, and London Art Fair. In 2022, she curated the Brighton Beacon Collection, the largest permanent display of queer art in the UK, for Soho House Brighton. Gemma has taught at numerous institutions, including the Royal College of Art, Glasgow School of Art, and Goldsmiths, and is a juror for the 2025 John Moores Painting Prize. She sits on the Courtauld Association Committee and the Leslie Lohman Museum Acquisitions Committee. Maggie Thrash is a Southerner born in Atlanta. Her graphic memoir, Honor Girl, is about first love at an all-girls summer camp in Kentucky. She narrowly escaped being forced to be a debutante by her mother and went to Hampshire College in Massachusetts. She now lives in New Hampshire. Her first adult novel, Rainbow Black, is an epic legal drama set during the Satanic Panic of the late 1980s. It is a New England Book Award finalist and Mother Jones Best 2024. So we'll get started with a general question, asking each author to respond briefly, and then we'll get into more specific questions for the individual authors. So we're discussing queer lit as resistance. What or who are we resisting? Are these ongoing battles, new battles, regional, global?
I can go first.
Please do.
I think we're resisting a lot of things, but one of the things that comes to my mind is the idea that queerness or queer people should be silenced or diminished in some way, and that queerness is something to be ashamed of. And I think by writing queer stories, we are fighting back against that narrative. We're fostering empathy. We're telling stories from all queer people of all different identities and all different walks of life. And we're showing, I think, that there is a need for these stories as well, by just publishing them and being, the more we keep putting them out there.
I can answer. I think for me, what I feel personally called to resist is conformity and hypocrisy. And I think those are, for the most part, politically neutral values. I think all sides of the spectrum can embody those things. Right now, of course, I think we're seeing it much more from the right with book banning, censorship, just the total double standards of what we're told is acceptable. Like free speech is only acceptable if it's not gay free speech. Like that's absolutely just disgusting and intolerable to me.
I'll go. I think one thing that queer literature has the potential to do is to resist the increasing hegemony of AI. And I think queer lit is especially equipped to do this because as a genre, it has the potential to critique and destabilize normativity, right? Easy categorization. Queer lit plays, it teases, it provokes, right? It functions in ways that are really counter to AI's like completely flat, empty prose. And honestly, I think original writing itself is really starting to become an explicit challenge in a world increasingly turning to these LLMs for knowledge and for entertainment.
Very well said.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add, I think those are all brilliant answers. I would just add that, so many of the artists that I work with and write about are working against the restrictions on us being able to live openly and freely as who we are. And I'm really conscious all the time that it really depends when you lived, where you live, the community and culture that you grew up in, that you exist in, and it, the differences in our experiences are vast, and books have a huge power to transgress some of those geographical and time-based boundaries because they can travel all around the world and people can access them when they can't access other things. And I feel like through my book and other books about queer art, not that there are very many, but it's a way to build community through space and time, and that feels really powerful and important.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and move into the first round of author-specific questions. This one's for Logan Sage Adams. How do you approach writing queerness in your specific niche or subgenre? Do you strive to change the narrative when it comes to how queer people or queer relationships are depicted in other works in your subgenre?
Yeah, I definitely do try to change the narrative. I write historical romance, and a lot of times when people think of historical romances, they think of queer suffering and queer trauma. And what I try to write I don't write a queer normative world, but I do write in a way that I give my main characters people in their lives who accept them and who love them. And I try to really show lots of I try to show a lot of different types of happily ever afters, because a happily ever after for a queer couple in 1920 isn't going to look the same as a happily ever after for queer couples today necessarily, though of course they could be similar, but there were different challenges that they faced back then. And I tried to show like the pockets of acceptance in society throughout time. And I think that that's really important, rather than only focusing on queer trauma, is to kind of to show that queer people have always been here and have always had or many times had people in their lives who loved them and who accepted them. They weren't written about in history books, and a lot of times their stories weren't openly told or passed down because of the way society was. So I try to really explore that in my books. And I also want to create a way for queer people to consume historical romance in a different way. I've, had other queer friends of mine who were initially afraid to read my books because they were like, I don't want to read Brokeback Mountain, basically. I don't want to read that. And, then when they were able to see that that's not what I'm writing, they were very happy that they were able to explore these different time periods and have fun with them, because they're so interesting, but not have to worry, am I going to get a happily ever after, or how much are you going to put me through before I get?
Yes. I'm going to try not to make too many comments of my own. I want to hear what you guys have to say. I am really enjoying your answers. Carrie, this one's for you. Definitionally, queer romance depicts queer joy, but how does queer pain relief impact those stories too?
So I want to start by jumping off of what Logan just said, that, joy is a critical part of queer romance, obviously of romance in general, because the HEA is essential. And Logan's, what you were speaking about regarding how, your historical romance gives us a different perspective of what queerness can be than maybe some of our assumptions about it. That's absolutely integral, right? We need these books in queer romance. I also feel that we need books that acknowledge the ways that queer pain and queer grief can participate in structuring these happy endings, that they can be mutually co-constructed. I think we're all probably aware that there's been a lot of pushback over the last decade or so against media that emphasizes or overemphasizes queer pain, right? The Bury Your Gays movement. And I definitely think that it's important that we think critically about how we're representing that pain. But I also think that disappearing it entirely does a really major disservice to the multidimensionality and the humanity of being queer. And one reason that I really love queer romance so much is that I think it has the potential to refuse to eliminate joy and pain, right? To show that both of these things are and always have been an essential part of queer experiences. This is something I really attempted to do in Loser Veer, which is a book about two queer teachers who have to hide their identities in order to be employed at their conservative Catholic high school. It's a pretty angsty book. So the HEA is actually, in some respects, totally dependent on the pain, in that Jillian, one of my characters who's dealing with a lot of religious trauma, she has to face that trauma head on in order to be emotionally ready for a healthy relationship. So her HEA doesn't erase her trauma, but it does give her a space within which she feels fully loved and worthy. And I think that's a really important tool in beginning to heal from emotional pain.
I don't know if I can comment, but I want to say I love that. And yeah, that's it.
I loved what you said too, Logan.
Gemma, why is a queer artwork important?
Well, I think also riffing off what Logan and Carrie said, they both spoke about writing books that, imagine alternative ways of being. Like Logan spoke about putting characters that are accepting, for example. And that's something that artists play a really important role in, is imagining different ways of being, whether that's looking backwards and rewriting history, or inserting our presence into histories where we've been erased, or whether it's looking forwards and, creating speculative futurisms or alternative worlds that queer people will be able to thrive in. There's such a power in the kind of creative force within the visual art world. And so that's not really answering your question. That's why queer art is important, but why a queer art book is important, and why I wrote my book, Queer Art, is because throughout all of art history, there are so many examples of queer people making art and of artists making art about the queer experience. But art history has been really good at ignoring that opportunity to frame the queer narrative. And so what I've done with my book is apply a queer lens to the last 60 years of art, and there's real value in that. There's so many artists that are queer and that have been making explicitly queer work that we know all about, that are in the mainstream, like David Hockney, Andy Warhol, Robert Indiana, all these, lots of, those are all examples of white cis men, because of course they're the ones that dominate the canon of art history. But it felt so important to frame their work through the queerness. Some of those artists, like David Hockney, for example, was making explicitly gay work, like gay work in the 1960s, making etchings of two boys in bed together. But that just hasn't been spoken about at all, really, and it's kind of been missed out of the conversations. And then there are so many queer artists, so many female identifying artists, trans artists, artists of color, that just haven't really been written about at all. And so thinking about those intersectional identities felt really important in a book as well. So yeah, my book, Queer Art, From Canvas to Club and the Spaces Between, is really the first book that offers that kind of look in a way that's accessible, and anybody, whether you know about art or the art world or not, can pick up that book. And that just felt really important because it didn't exist.
Thank you, Gemma. Maggie, can you discuss how queer people exemplify the American dream, but get punished for doing so? How does this affect resistance?
I find it really funny that we've already, Brokeback Mountain has already come up in this conversation. It's like you start talking about like queerness in America, and it's only a matter of time before like Brokeback comes up, because, and I love Brokeback Mountain, and I think the reason that movie is so important is because it kind of exemplifies how queer identity is so part of the American identity in a way that, like we exemplify the American dream as much as a cowboy or a coal miner or a fighter pilot or any of the archetypes that, like on the right, they often summon to represent America. And because it's about individual freedom and a kind of like pioneering spirit, if you will, like having to kind of figure out how to be gay. For most of American history, like we've had to figure it out ourselves individually alone, because you grow up, you don't get to choose your parents. You grow up fractured from gay role models. You have to find them yourself. And I think that is essentially American in a way that we can be kind of like patriotic about if we want to. And the other way in which, like, I think queerness can essentially be like tied to this American spirit is that it tends to manifest in the US as legal battles. It's all about the legal system. And, America is the most litigious country on earth. 1 in 300 people in the US is a lawyer. So you can go to a Taylor Swift concert and assume that there is like at least 1,000 lawyers in the crowd. So I think the fact that like the queer struggle has really been a legal struggle in the US. It's like, yes, that is part of our like American identity, and it doesn't necessarily manifest that way in other countries and in other cultures. And I think it's important to be aware of that, that like our American relationship to queerness is not the same relationship queer people in other countries and cultures have.
Thanks, Maggie. Here's another general question for all of you to answer, if you wish. We often hear that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, but for LGBTQ folks, is the reverse true? Do we need to learn from our past not to avoid repeating mistakes, but to make sure we can repeat our successes under previous oppressive systems?
I can start because my answer is related to my previous answer. I think the unfortunate answer, which I don't like either, but the unfortunate answer is that in the past, most of our successes have come from picking our battles, and those have been legal battles, like the extreme laser focus on gays in the military in the 90s, followed by the extreme laser focus on legal marriage in the 2000s. And those were two issues that many queer people did not care about at all. Many queer people wanted more radical, holistic societal change than just admittance into two of the most heteronormative, like violent institutions known to man, war and marriage. But we did have a lot of success focusing on those two things, kind of at the expense of greater radical change. And I see it from this perspective because my father is a judge, my mother is a lawyer. I'm very like acutely aware, growing up gay in that household, I became like very acutely aware of how queerness is expressed through the legal system. And that does seem to be the main realm where we've had like lots of success. Not that that isn't, under total threat of being undone now, but.
I think that's a really interesting answer. And I think, I think about history a lot in the work that I'm doing specifically, but, I think we have so much to learn from history. And something that, I've been speaking with lots of artists about more recently is how, we see these cycles and we see patterns cropping up again. So for example, right now, our trans siblings within our community are the people being targeted the most across the West in terms of the media and legally as well, like Maggie was talking about. But the language that is being used to persecute people feels extremely familiar and is like the language that was being used to target gay men during the AIDS crisis, for example. There are so many examples of like that through history where it's just the focus has shifted slightly to different members within our broader community, and that will happen because we have such a beautifully broad and diverse community. That's one of the joys of being queer, and so these things crop up, and so there's a lot to learn, I think, in terms of the solidarity that we can take from connecting with our elders and reflecting on the experiences of our ancestors as well. And that's why, like, within literature but also visual art, you can place stories side by side. We have that creative tool that we can change time, and we can change the kind of linear basis of time. We can queer time because of how we want to present stories and things. And I think when you do that, really interesting things happen because you can draw connections through time.
I'll jump in here. So as an educator, I think a lot about the importance of sharing our history with younger queer people, queer teens, queer people in their 20s who just really have very little knowledge of it. And it's not because they don't want to, it's not because they're not interested. They don't know where or how to access it. I teach a course on queer literature at the college level. So my students are, 19, 20, 21, most of them, and half of them had never heard of Stonewall. They just didn't know about it. And What was really interesting about the last time I taught this course, which was in the first 5 months of the second Trump administration, so that was what was going on in the general climate, one of the books that we read was Stone Butch Blues, and which none of them had read before or even heard of. And that was the text that they connected with the most throughout the semester. And they told me it was because it felt like a guide to them for how to push back against these current horrors, right? It spoke to them in ways that the queer romances that I assigned with the HEAs, those books didn't really speak to them because that's not where they are, right? And so they want to learn how to fight back. They want to learn that queer people have been here before and we have survived, because they need to feel that hope. Right. So I think that making sure that we, as quote unquote older queer people, I'm in my early 40s, so I'll include myself there, as older queer people, we have a responsibility to share the history that we know, some of us, the history that we've experienced with these younger folks, so that they can, continue to grow and learn.
I don't know that I have a lot more to add on top of what everyone else has said so eloquently. But I think, Gemma mentioned together, coming together. And I think that is a, really powerful tool of resistance. And I just wanted to echo that sentiment.
Thank you. I have a question now for Carrie and Logan. What specific forms of resistance can queer romance offer?
Do you want to go first?
You go first, Logan. Okay. You go first. Yeah.
I think something that queer romance can offer is pushing back against heteronormativity. And I think that is so important to show all of the different types of happily ever afters that there are for queer people, and also the different paths that people can take to get there. And I think that's just a very powerful tool of resistance. And I'll just specifically for my work, kind of echoing what I said earlier about queer people always having been here, and we've just mentioned that as well, is that I think that is is an empowering idea. And so presenting that in a romance and showing queer people overcoming different kinds of struggles throughout time, and what different kinds of happily ever afters can look like for the main couple, for side characters, and just I write a lot of found family too, which is, I think, kind of comforting and empowering to queer people, especially those today who have unfortunately lost people in their lives for their queerness. And I think that hope is a powerful tool and motivator.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think, jumping off of what you've just said, Logan, that a guaranteed HEA in romance is very, very powerful in a climate where our happiness is directly and increasingly threatened. So I think we can also think of resistance as a kind of sanctuary too, like a space that provides certainty in a deeply uncertain world. I really do think that that's one of the most remarkable things that romance offers us. Romance, as we all know, gets dismissed as formulaic, but that HEA has tremendous power, especially within a queer context, because when a reader picks up a queer romance, that reader gets to spend hours, days in a world where they know 100% that these queer people will get to love each other for the rest of their lives. And I think, especially in the current climate, that's an extremely powerful thing.
Wait, if I can ask, you keep saying HEA. I don't know what that means.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's happily ever after. Thank you for asking that. I sometimes forget that.
Me too.
Not everybody necessarily knows about, what romance does. So yeah, HEA is a happily ever after.
Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you for explaining that. I love that.
Yes. Maggie, what are the limits of queer literature's capacity for resistance?
I think the limit is I think books are about stirring feelings within the reader, stirring empathy, stirring just allowing them to get swept away in the protagonist's story. And that's kind of as much as I try to do. Anything didactic or lecturing, I try to avoid because it's counterproductive. Sometimes I can't help myself. Like in my recent book, Rainbow Black, there's a nice page in the conclusion that's basically just like, Maggie's thoughts about life. And my editor was like, can we tone this down? And I was like, I'm keeping it. I'm going to get on my soapbox for just like one page in this book. And sometimes I'm like, I probably shouldn't have, but whatever. For the most part, I think literature is humanizing. You get to see all the minute emotional details of a character's life. And that is powerful enough. In high school, I was really impacted by the book, The Jungle, which is about like the horrors of the meatpacking industry on the like Lithuanian immigrants in the early 1900s. And it was such a powerful book until at the very end, it just becomes a 50-page monologue about the virtues of communism. And it's like, as soon as the storytelling falls away and it's just a lecture, I think the book completely fails. So I try to really remember that when I'm tempted to like get on my high horse and just give the reader a lecture. I remember how it felt to be a 16-year-old reading The Jungle and how much that completely failed for me and how it's going to fail. I'm not like the exception. I'm not like a better writer than Upton Sinclair. Like it's going to fail when I try to do it too.
Thanks, Maggie. Gemma, what role does art and culture play in resistance?
Well, I think, whether it's the written word or visual art that we're talking about, kind of like what Maggie was just saying, like what you can do through this creative world is you can share different perspectives. And so like by like sharing the story that demonstrates the argument, you can get people on board. I think it can be a more compelling way to bring people in, and I think art and culture has a real power to change the way people think and to make people consider what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes, in a way that, like Maggie was saying, those kind of super didactic things just don't always, mostly don't, I would say, in fact. And so I think that's the great gift of creatives and creativity. And, certainly with my book, I work in the art world. I have done for 20 plus years. So I'm kind of totally in this space. And I think I had underestimated the power of a book like mine, or, something that was signposted as queer and signaled that this was a queer book, a queer space. And whenever I've been doing book signings, the kind of things that people have come up and said to me have really been extremely moving, but also quite hopeful. Like, for example, I had a man who was, I think, like in his 60s, who bought my book, and he came up and he asked me to sign it. And he said, I recently came out to my wife and children. I've been reflecting on why I didn't come out sooner. I had a brother who died of HIV/AIDS related complications, and it put me right back in the closet. And I feel like this book will help me have some of the conversations with my children that I don't otherwise know how to have. And that is so encouraging and something that we really need to remember, I think, when we're doing this work and championing creativity. I've also just had loads of people buy this book and say, this is for a 15-year-old in my life, and I want them to know that I think they're fabulous. Or like I had a grandmother say, I'm buying your book for my granddaughter because she's trans and I want her to know that I'm proud of her. Like I think being able to give somebody something like a story that they can get their teeth into, that they can see themselves reflected in, has real power, because art and culture helps us make sense of who we are, and it can shape our identities. And often that, coming out and making sense of the self can be a really lonely experience, particularly for LGBTQIA plus people. And so, I think the role of art and culture cannot be underestimated.
Thank you. I'm so enjoying all of your answers to these questions. Very wonderful information here. Here's another question for whoever wants to answer this. Anti-trans sentiment in the UK is high. The far right's been gaining ground in Italy and other countries. Globally, authoritarianism is increasing. In the US, we're in a critical period where we all need to step up, but we can't all carry protest signs or meet with our representatives or confront ICE agents or donate large sums of money to good causes. There are dozens of useful ways to fight back. What role does storytelling have in resistance?
I can start. I'll just say that imagination is really key to liberation because you cannot get out of fascism if you can't imagine the conditions and the tools that will allow you to create a better world. So I think that storytelling really reminds us that imagination and narrative are not only mechanisms that help us fight, they are fundamentally central to our humanity. We're not human without the ability to create and share stories.
I think you said it.
I know, I'm like,
it was a wonderful answer. Imagination is the way out of fascism. Imagination as the way out of climate catastrophe. Imagination as the way out of our reliance on AI. Like all of these things are about encouraging people to think outside of current norms. And I think that has really been lost in this current moment. So I think that's something that as authors and art appreciators, we can encourage, and that's critical.
I think something else that literature can offer is helping people feel less alone, for sure. And that's, part of it is the imagination component of imagining what could be, but also being able to see ourselves reflected in stories. And I think also the fact that there are so many types of queer stories, there are so many identities, is we mentioned earlier, like people coming together and togetherness. And I think the more that we can empathize with people whose experiences are different from our own, the stronger that we can become to fight back against the global, the way that the world is going right now.
And Gemma, did you want to add to that, or would you like us to move on to the next?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think those were all beautiful answers. I totally agree.
Thanks. Logan, when logic and facts fail to convince those who oppose us, can queer literature push back against homophobia and transphobia in more persuasive ways?
I think so, but I do think that there's a limitation there. Maggie touched on it a little bit before, and I think part of the limitation might be that some of the people who need the most, I don't want to say convincing, but they need to foster the most empathy maybe for people in our queer community are not necessarily the people who are going to pick up our books. And I think that's really tough pill to swallow, is because we want, I know that when I'm writing my characters, I love them and I want other people to love them and to want them to have their happily ever after. So I do think there are limitations to it, but I do think that writing these queer characters and their stories can help foster empathy within our community, and can also help foster things like self-love and really just the hope for a better tomorrow, which I think is really important. But I didn't want to say that without also calling out what I think are potential limitations to literature. Yeah.
Thanks, Logan. This one really, this next question really could be for Carrie, Maggie, and Gemma. We've seen in recent years that visibility doesn't guarantee our liberation as queer people. Can queer privacy be a form of resistance?
I'll just dive right in since this is my question and I really want to talk about it. So I've been working on exploring this in my academic research and my academic life. I feel very strongly that we really need to start openly resisting the assumption that representation and visibility will inevitably result in our liberation, because I think we're seeing that it clearly won't. And that does not mean, I want to be very clear here, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't see ourselves. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't, see others, other queer people. Like, we should, but it is not the mechanism by which I think will ensure our thriving. So instead of queer visibility, I'm really attracted to this idea of queer privacy. And I want to differentiate that from queer hiding, because privacy is something that you choose for yourself. It's an act of agency. You get to decide who sees you, when, how people see you. And I think that's especially powerful in this age of state and technological surveillance as well. That's like the other component to it. So I want our strategies to respond and adapt to the violence of our circumstances, to sort of recognize what we're dealing with. And, sometimes that means we're drawing the curtain, we're shutting the blinds. Sometimes it means we want to close that closet door. And that doesn't necessarily mean a regression. It can be an act of protection, an act of survival. I think to retreat is sometimes something that creates the necessary space for flourishing.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting question, and I really enjoyed what you had to say about it, Carrie. Something that I have written about quite a lot is queer visual coding, and so artists creating languages and symbols that signal to those in the know what it is that they're speaking to, which, depending on where or when somebody was making art or writing a book, was really necessary. And I think there are so many things that we can learn from history about that, and there's a real power to be taken from it. It's become really obvious of late that visibility can, in fact, particularly for trans people, be extremely dangerous. And it feels like we're going through these waves, in terms of us as a global community. I can hear my kids laughing in the background. They're laughing hysterically at a movie. But I also think for the individual, the privacy point is really important, because and I think it depends, and it's changing depending on the generation that you're in and where you live. But certainly for me, when I was making sense of my identity and coming out, like I really needed space and time to process what was happening, and actually feeling the pressure to broadcast what was happening or to fit myself into a box was really difficult and confused the process. So I think that private space that Carrie was talking about, it can be something that becomes very nurturing. It can be really fruitful in terms of us kind of becoming the resilient people that we need to be, to then be able to be visible and be out living freely and openly.
I think for me, it's not so much about like privacy as a mechanism for betterment, or like for moving ahead in the movement. For me, it's just like I'm ready for us as queer people to have our mystique back. Like, I'm just ready to be a mysterious gay again. In the times in my life where I've like really tried to kind of do the work of like communicating with straight people about my sex life and being like, this is how it is, I have felt like such a freak show. I have felt like a circus freak, and I'm just done with that. I'm done like being open about my sex life. I'm just done. I've never felt good about it. It's always and just this feeling of duty that we have as queer people to do that. I'm like absolutely done with that.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. That was all good. See, we've got about 15 minutes left. Here's another general question for everyone. Kind of a long question here. American queer icons, Rosie O'Donnell, Ellen DeGeneres, Greg Louganis, and others have moved to other countries from the U.S. in recent months. Many of us have friends who have already left the U.S., afraid for their safety in our increasingly impressive political environment. Can we fight from afar? How can our LGBTQ brothers and sisters in the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and elsewhere fight their own battles at home and help LGBTQ folks in the US or other countries? Can we resist, either here or abroad, from a position privileged enough to afford us the opportunity to write and publish?
Pardon me. Gemma, I'm curious to hear your answer to this as someone who, to us, is abroad, but in your own context, you're not abroad to yourself. And so many of our conversations are US centering that I'm curious to hear your answer.
Yeah, thank you. Again, it's a really interesting question. And I do typically work a lot in the US as well as, I live in London and my wife and children are here and this is my home. But over the last several years, I have done a lot of work in the US, and actually 2025, I made a decision to try and spend more time in the UK and Europe for several reasons, but the political climate was absolutely one of them. And a lot of the museums that I work with in the US have lost their federal funding, and so the kind of queer and trans programming that we were collaborating on has been more difficult to deliver, or needed to wait, which is really complicated to think about. But being here in the UK, I have lots of friends here who have come from the US in the last year or two, actually. And I am certainly seeing people come here as a temporary situation to kind of regroup and find some joy and build connections and kind of, I guess, have some respite in order to be stronger to then return home at some point. But unfortunately, like Johnny said, the situation in the UK is also getting worse, and across Europe. Yeah, like you said, Johnny, Italy is particularly bad. So many things have been brought in, like the lesbian mums having their children, having their rights taken away from their children, their parental rights. So there is kind of a lot going on. But I do think it's something that personally I go back and forth on because of my kind of the territories that I've traditionally worked in, because there's part of me that wants to continue working in the US and show up as much as I can because it feels even more important. But then at the same time, I think as individuals and creatives, we also have to think about our own kind of mental health and, think about if we're going to make the best work that we can, what does that environment need to look like? And I think as queer people, this is like a kind of constant battle anyways, like how do we balance our activism with our safety, and how does that shift depending on what's going on in our lives at any one moment? So I think it's kind of same old questions that we're used to asking of ourselves. But I do think the need to form, community and learn from each other and really just give each other strength, whether we're separated by an ocean, a border, whatever it might be, just feels all the more important.
I think it's kind of an illusion that there's anywhere to escape to. Like, we are all in this together. It's a global community. We are all in danger from climate change. I think I'm not going anywhere. I'm sticking it out here. I think as Americans, we've enjoyed a lot of privileges, and now it's time to stay home and fix things. We've had a lot of comforts, and it's about to not get so comfortable. But the answer for me isn't to leave. I find like these queer icons, Rosie O'Donnell, Ellen DeGeneres, like what they all have in common is having millions and millions and millions of dollars. And I don't see that they've really escaped America. They've just escaped with their money. They're just creating walled gardens for themselves and creating an illusion that they've left these problems behind. But I don't think they've escaped either. Sorry, that answer was so grim.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I loved that. I love that answer.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think just to maybe jump off of that, that those of us who have some privilege within the community, and I'm specifically thinking about those of us who are white, who are cis, who have housing, those of us who live under safer conditions in states that are not directly attacking our rights. So those of us who sort of fit that category, I think it's really critical that we use our privilege to speak out and affect what change we can, right? To Maggie's point about like, it's our turn, like we got to show up. This is a situation we have and we have to deal with it. And we need to do what we can, right? Not just through our writing, but through other work as well, right? There's all sorts of ways to push back that don't necessarily require you to be an activist.
One thing I would just add that's really, specific to this conversation as well is that when there is something to resist, we know that great art is going to come out of that moment. We've seen it throughout history and we're seeing it now, whether it's literature, I'm talking, broadly about art and culture and literature within that. So I think that's kind of something that's exciting, and we need to look at what those silver linings are within this pretty bleak, landscape. And I think that's one of them for all of us that work in the creative industries.
Thank you, Gemma. Anything do you like to add, Logan, before we move to the next question?
I think that everyone covered it very well, and I absolutely agree with everyone's points that they've made about privilege and it being our time to use our power as creatives to speak out.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one more question, and then I'd like to encourage maybe one of you to think about maybe writing a nice, good article about this whole subject. And so the last question I think we might have time for on my list here is, what role does unapologetically and celebrating sex play in resistance?
I think it does serve a role. I think that sex positivity, I think heterosexual people need sex positivity even more than queer people do at this point. At this point as queer people, I think we feel, at least among each other, fairly sex positive. And it's kind of when we get outside our bubble that it's like, oh my God, what is happening to the straight people? What is going on with them? So I think that at this point, it's we're kind of in a role model position, which I didn't really ask for, but it's that's kind of where we are.
I would add, I think as so many definitions of queer and queerness state, bell hooks is one example. Sex and sexuality is part of queerness, but what we're talking about is so much more. But it is part of it, and there is so much joy to be found in sex positivity. And it's come up loads in this conversation that we need joy, we need those glimmers of hope, and so sometimes reading a really sexy book can be the greatest way to have some hope, and that's really important.
Yeah, I think that there's also a great opportunity when writing about sex to show the breadth of human sexuality, and to also kind of challenge some assumptions or things that people have, just as an example, within the ACE spectrum, there are absolutely people who are asexual and who enjoy sex. Those aren't mutually exclusive things. And I think that to be able to write scenes to show that is also just really exciting and powerful thing that we are able to do.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I'm thinking about this, of course, in the context of sapphic romance, because that's what I write. That's what I focus on. And so I think when we're talking about attention being paid to our work, I think it's important to ask who is paying attention to us, right? Who is reading us? And so for sapphic romance, it is almost entirely sapphic. Like there's a few exceptions, right? But we are talking to each other with these books. This is within the community, right? So we are able to create this, I think, pretty remarkable space where we get to explore what sex means to us collectively, individually, and we get to do that outside of a heteronormative or even male-centered gaze, which can be really powerful. So I have this book coming out next year where a 60-year-old woman realizes that she's a lesbian when she falls in love with her 56-year-old best friend. And I've included a lot of sex scenes in that book. And that was crucial to me. That was a very, very deliberate choice I made because I think it honestly is kind of a resistance to write older women fucking, and I'm using that word very intentionally, to write them fucking in ways that are intended to be a turn on for readers, right? Because that's a choice that creates space for older sapphic women to have desires in a culture that almost completely erases them. So that was really important to me.
I love that.
Excellent. Thanks so much, everyone. I'll just kind of leave my last thought here. The comment attributed to Emma Goldman. If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. Having joy is an act of resistance too. And I appreciate everything you guys have offered today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Johnny.
Thank you, everyone. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, great to hear, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.